I have to say it's a title which I consider deeply off-putting unless you happen to be a psychologist. And I hasten to add that there's going to be a certain amount of mix around the straight line of recounting the history of psychology teaching at Heythrop. I was invited to give a similar address several years ago now, and I've been asked originally to speak about my psychology teaching at Heythrop, and I thought that was even more restrictive. So I slightly scared the chair by telling them that I wasn't going to speak to the brief, but to the wider brief of psychology teaching at Heythrop, I'm happy to speak because it involves thinking a little bit about the history of Heythrop as a whole, which is never a bad thing to do. And I think it's especially worth doing as we approach what I want to characterize as the end of another chapter in the story of Heythrop. The end of another chapter in the story. So I trust that what I have to offer will be of interest to those whose direct concern about the academic study and teaching of psychology is perhaps a little tenuous. One aspect that may intrigue, that came to light when I was working on this, is that at least some of the features recognizable towards the start of this history are strangely reminiscent of the present day. Well, where to begin? Well schooled in Anglo-Saxon philosophy, and I too pay my respects to Jerry Hughes. I was one of those who he taught when he first came back from Ann Arbor and had a most wonderful Michigan twang to his voice, which gradually subsided and let the West of Scotland emerge. But schooled by him and indeed many others here, I can do no better than to start by noting it all depends what you mean by Heythrop. And in what follows, I'm going to cheat slightly by referring to the college in its different phases of existence as Heythrop, rather than get into the college later to be known as Heythrop. So you'll know from your own association with the college that Heythrop is an ancient foundation, and one founded in exile. For a number of years after our arrival in Kensington Square in 1993, the foundation date was recalled in the entry code for the front door. It was a stroke of genius on the part of Ted O'Connor, one of the able administrators who helped us move the college here from Cavendish Square. Each time any of us entered the campus, we punched in 1614 and were reminded that we were coming into a college with history. Don't panic, I'm not going to plot in detail the teaching of psychology all the way from Flanders in the 17th century until the present day, but I would like us to recall that the college was already 180 years old when it came home to Britain in 1794, and that Heythrop had been operating in this country for 32 years before the University of London came into being. History is history. We have serious history. A very brief glimpse of how Heythrop reinvented itself several times over that period of more than 200 years rather puts current concerns in perspective. It doesn't stop them being concerns, but it puts them in perspective. And it may support my comment that this is the end of a chapter rather than the closing of a book. Back to that originating date of 1614. To be a Roman Catholic in England in that year was a risky and unpredictable experience. The decade may have seen the designing by Inigo Jones of the exquisite Queen's House at Greenwich and the first productions of Shakespeare's A Winter's Tale. But the same decade was also marked by the burning of men and women after being tried in a court of law and found guilty of witchcraft. It was also only 8 years since the Gunpowder Plot, which had given rise to a resurgence of anti-foreigner and anti-Catholic sentiment that was carefully nourished by skillful government propaganda. I didn't have a note here about looking for contemporary parallels, about nourished sentiments, but it suddenly strikes me there's something familiar there. Priests were still being condemned in the courts as guilty of treason by being priests in this country, Catholic priests, and so liable to execution by some pretty horrific means. To train as a priest in the England of James I and VI, and that's what we're talking about, was impossible, and it was treasonous. It was a criminal act of treason to go overseas to prepare for ordination. But still, men felt called to priesthood and the religious life, and so in 1614 the English Jesuits established a college in Louvain to train their young men. The politics of that time soon led to a move to Liège, then ruled by a prince-bishop, so a sort of semi-autonomous city-state, where the college remained, mark this, for 170 years, and managed to survive as a college of priests and students even when the Society of Jesus was suppressed in 1773. But the reign of terror unleashed by the French Revolution eventually made it more dangerous to be an English priest in Liège than in England, and in 1794 the college moved again, this time coming home. Alongside the college or seminary in exile for aspirant priests and would-be Jesuits in Liège, there was also a college in exile for English Catholic boys. And it was an alumnus of this school who gave the multi-layered college its first English home at Stonyhurst in Lancashire, where the school still flourishes as a co-ed Catholic boarding school. The owners, who were the Wells, had Stonyhurst in Lancashire, halfway up a rather bleak fell, up and down which I ran many times as a schoolboy, and a rather splendid house in Lulworth Cove in Dorset. It was a no-brainer which one we got, but it was still deeply generous. 4 decades later, the University of London finds its first shape in what is now University College. With the 2 ancient universities south of the border, things were much more civilized north of the border, but the 2 ancient universities south of the border still required allegiance to the 39 articles of religion of the Church of England. The godless institution in Gower Street was founded in 1826 by a wondrous amalgam of just about everyone who wasn't an Anglican. One of its founder members, you may know, has recently travelled the Atlantic. Jeremy Bentham's auto icon is now in Washington for a brief visit, but they'll bring him back, and no doubt they'll continue to wheel him into governing body meetings, as is the ancient tradition of UCL. Ancient, but not as ancient as ours. From very early on in its history, London University recognised colleges all over the country, and eventually all over the colonies, the Empire, and the Commonwealth, as suitable places to prepare for its degrees. And in 1840, the college at Stonyhurst became one such. So Heythrop's associations with the University of London are much older than most of us think they are most of the time. Many of those other colleges, by the way, grew into universities in their own right, though tending in these competitive days to play down their infancies as offsprings of London. And the international programs of the university continue that tradition of outreach beyond London itself. Well, with the Society of Jesus restored, numbers of Jesuit students grew, and in 1848 there were too many to accommodate at Stonyhurst, and those teaching and studying theology left the philosophers behind and moved to St. Beno's. Jesuits for decades have called it Binos. We are slowly listening to our Welsh neighbours who have consistently and correctly called it Beno. We moved to St. Benos in North Wales, on the hillside overlooking the incomparable Vale of Clwyd, to the mountains of Snowdonia. That was 1848. In 1926, the two faculties reunited at Heythrop Hall, 15 miles north of Oxford. And in the 1960s, permission was given to award degrees to those who were not Jesuits. And the wonderful diversity that's marked modern Heythrop began to show itself. Among the very first students to start attending lectures at what had been simply a Jesuit seminary were the Passionists, who lived in Broadway and who rocketed across the Cotswolds in a minibus, I'm assured, each morning and each afternoon, in full habit, of course, in those days. I'm assured that the legend that as they rocketed over the Cotswolds, they recited the office side to side in the minibus is nothing but a legend, but it's one that bears entertaining. What quickly became clear in the 60s was that to be of use, the degrees granted needed to be from a UK university, and after various sets of negotiations, the college moved to London. To be more precise, and as the University of London insisted was to be made clear, a new college was set up. We always talk about Heythrop moving to London, partly because Heythrop moves. Now that could be another of those little sentences we were looking for earlier on in the day. But legally speaking, a new college was set up. To mark the new beginning, London University insisted that the college not be called Heythrop. Anything but. Loyola, fine. Bellarmine, fine. Campion, yeah, well, probably fine. Let's not think about the Reformation. Anything as long as it wasn't Heythrop. But the Jesuits wanted the name to be carried over because we had, by that stage, an academic tradition associated with the name, and putting it simply, London blinked first. We need to loop back several steps and across more than a century to touch on the start of the teaching of psychology as such at Heythrop. Of course, philosophy of mind had been taught previously, and at some point, the courses in philosophy of mind acquired the title of rational psychology, which always leaves me wondering about whether there was an irrational psychology course which didn't get taught. But psychology as an empirical science was yet to emerge. Perhaps the closing decades of the 19th century can be as good a time as any to locate this development. That's when William James was appointed the first professor of psychology at Harvard. It's 10 years, that happened in 1875. In 1885, Freud first went to Paris and made the observations regarding hypnosis, which gave rise to his psychology of the unconscious. Rational psychology was a part of philosophy. So it was at Stonyhurst with the philosophy section of the college that this approach to reflecting on human functioning was being taught. That's probably why it's also at Stonyhurst that the new discipline of empirical psychology first finds a place within Heythrop's teaching. The first edition of the earliest textbook I have to hand dates from around 1890. My own copy is of the 6th edition, published in 1905. It was written by a Father Michael Marr, a Jesuit, and it's a careful compendium of both empirical and rational psychology, with the two disciplines very clearly delineated in terms of their methods. What I find intriguing is that when Marr sets out the variety of methods in empirical psychology, he does set out a variety of methods. He notes introspection, yes, the study of language and languages, developmental and cross-cultural studies, animal psychology. Marr comments, sometimes questionably dignified with the title of comparative psychology, physiology, pathology, psychiatry, and more strictly experimental psychology, including both psychometrics and psychophysics. So Marr, in his time, certainly agrees with William James that what we pull together under the umbrella title of psychology is, in fact, as James put it, a series of questions requiring answers along several different lines of inquiry. I came across a contemporary review of Marr's book in The Scotsman, no less. And it tells us that, and I'll, with difficulty, resist the temptation of attempting an Edinburgh accent. His work, but it's best heard if you can imagine an Edinburgh accent. His work consists of an introduction in 3 chapters dealing with the scope and method of psychology and the classification of the mental faculties, and of 2 books, of which the first treats in 2 parts of the phenomena, first of the sensuous, then of the rational life, while the second considers the underlying ground of these phenomena, or the origin and constitution of the soul itself. Well, there's a gear change for you. On the positive side of his subject, it's unnecessary to say the author has nothing new to advance. Still, taken for what it professes to be, this is an excellent manual. It deserves and will repay study. Well, the textbook also includes a response to a certain W.H. Mallock, who seems to be the Richard Dawkins of his day, and who asserted that psychology, biology, and physics exclude and negate belief in a personal God, free will, a spiritual soul, and a future life. I use the term assert because Marr seems to suggest that Mr. Mallock is stronger on rhetoric than on logic and proof. And if you're thinking of possible parallels, I couldn't possibly comment. Moving back to the wider dimensions of Heythrop's history for a moment, we can remind ourselves that theology and philosophy, having operated on the side of the Vale of Clwyd, the slopes of Longridge Fell above the Ribble Valley, had come together in 1926 on the flat lands of North Oxfordshire at Heythrop. It was a long way from Gerard Manley Hopkins' pastoral forehead of Wales, and even further from the finest half house in England, as Heythrop had been, as Stonyhurst had been described. But Heythrop Hall became the home of the college for 44 years, and it's given it, the college, its enduring name. Heythrop at Heythrop continued the tradition of teaching both rational and empirical psychology. Well-founded legend has it that it was the empirical psychology teachers at Heythrop who were called on to maintain psychology in another seat of learning, reasonably well known, 15 miles south down the road, because the Second World War saw the empirical psychologists of Oxford University drafted into the war effort, contributing to the work of selecting future army officers and the like in a wonderful series of structures called WASB. I was trying to remember what the acronym unpacks into, and War Office is the first 2 letters. Selection boards, thank you very much. Certainly at Heythrop, in between propping up, as is our wont, other universities, the tradition of empirical teaching and research was maintained, albeit without the scourge of the various research assessment exercises driving publication rates. It was a gentler time. Commuting was a matter of strolling from one side of the house to the other, and there was a private golf course to hand, albeit only 9 holes and replete with moving hazards such as sheep, and 2 miles of drive before the main road was reached. But psychology teaching was maintained, and the research included a long-term investigation conducted by George Croft, who had his PhD from Fordham University in New York City, into the factors associated with perseverance in the religious life. In other words, who stays and who sees the light and goes. I have to confess, and at this point I have to own up to a conflict of interest because I was one of his subjects. I have to confess that the only 2 factors I can recall of the study were that birth order was significant, where you came in your family was significant, but for the life of me, I can't remember where was significant, possibly because I know where I come in my family. And that those who persevered, those who stayed, showed up with different scores on the lie trap scales built into most bits of psychometric personality testing. You may not be surprised that it's the ones who stayed who lied more. Lying in the sense of doing a sort of snow job on oneself and presenting oneself better. It was my fellow Jesuit, George Croft, who brought the Heythrop psychology teaching to London. Incidentally, alive and in his 90s and working in Zimbabwe. Still utterly amazing. But in his relative youth, he was a mere 50 or 60, he brought the Heythrop psychology teaching to London when the college was reconstituted as a school of the Federal University. At that stage, the only university degree for which the college taught, at the very beginning, was the BD, the Federal Undergraduate Theology degree, which was taught in what were then 4 schools of theology in the university. Empirical psychology was taught as part of the philosophy program, which at that point, we are taking the clock back to early 1970s, was a college course. It was made available for ordinands who were then and still are required to study philosophy for 2 years. And there were eventually several modules in psychology in the pastoral diploma, which was George's great legacy to the college, giving rise as it did to the pastoral studies department and the development of a once growing, I shouldn't cut and paste, a range of degrees which grew and led to the renaming of the department as Pastoral and Social Studies. Philosophy teaching came along with the joint honours in philosophy and theology. I think there are a number of distinguished Jesuit graduates of that program sitting in front of me. And then for a while, the teaching of empirical psychology in the university in Heythrop came to an end. But the pastoral teaching continued to have modules in psychology, and in 1980 I found myself assigned to begin teaching in the pastoral diploma. A very brief word on the preparation for that, maybe to the point. When I first asked if I could study psychology, having followed George Croft's empirical psychology course at Heythrop in Oxfordshire, the director of studies asked me whether he could speak to my spiritual director, which I thought was a slightly unusual request, but one I was happy to go along with, but I asked him why. He was a very sort of fondly spoken man. Just to check out, dear, because so many psychologists end up leaving the Jesuits. So I did my own studies. I spent one happy afternoon tapping snails on the head and measuring how far they took their horns in, and the amount of time I spent doing that vanished by comparison with the number of dinners that a fellow member of Campion Hall, Oxford, enjoyed telling that story to bemused at high tables. I ended up teaching here. The pastoral diploma was originally a college award. It had lots of half modules. It made it possible to explore things within a very flexible framework, to try them out. You weren't facing an external barrage of examiners. And I will touch on one module only that I taught. I was asked, or maybe I asked myself, to introduce people to the basic ideas of Jungian psychology. And I ran a seminar called the Earthsea Seminar. If you haven't read the books of Ursula Le Guin, you've missed a great introduction to Jungian psychology, totally painless and utterly enchanting. It's the only course I've ever taught where I had no difficulty getting people to do the assigned reading. Sterner stuff came along with the MTH in pastoral theology and a psychology of religion paper, and a very clear option to teach psychology of religion rather than religious psychology. In other words, using the lens of academic empirical psychology to look at religion and accepting as canons of argument and proof the canons and arguments of empirical psychology. There was also an undergraduate option in psychology of religion, and everything was going extremely well until an extremely unwise board of governors decided they wanted me to be principal. So those papers just sort of ticked over for the next 13 years, basically. My present to myself, awarded by an academic board which was so pleased to see its chairman stepping down, they'd have agreed with any proposal that I made, was the MA in Psychology of Religion. For a good number of years, that was the only master's level program in the psychology of religion in the English-speaking world. There are now others. There's at least one in Wales, and the last time I counted, there were 2 in Sweden. And if you're thinking English-speaking, trust me, they speak much better English in Sweden than we do here. The master's program here attracted an assortment of students, which made it fascinating to work with. A small number of recent graduates in psychology, philosophy, theology, or religious studies, a larger number of psychology professionals, both practitioners and academics, and a roughly equal number of religious professionals, again, roughly equally divided between practitioners and teachers. Imagine, if you will, having a seminar discussion with that sort of mix. It was a total delight. Though it has to say, just occasionally there was a bit of misunderstanding across the various intellectual boundaries there. All was ticking along extremely well, with myself as a former principal looking after this program, and my Jesuit province then did 2 things which, in terms of my engagement with Heythrop, were unhelpful. I was appointed a formation assistant to my provincial, and then whisked off to be Master of Campion Hall in Oxford. So to talk about the more recent teaching of psychology of religion would be inappropriate. I'd just like to give a couple of thoughts about the research students, and I'm conscious that I'm speaking about the early research students in psychology of religion. Various topics within their fields of research, the role of religious upbringing in relation to child-rearing practices, the effect of religious belief on the length of psychiatric hospitalization, and no, I can't remember the relationship that emerged, the validity of James Fowler's stages of faith outside a European setting, faith development in adults, the ways in which individuals describe themselves to different church and non-church professionals. So if I ask you a question about your beliefs and I'm wearing a dog collar, you'll give me one sort of answer. If I turn out wearing a lab coat, so to speak, you might give me a different sort of description. And so on, and so on, and so on. A certain measure of continuity, or at least a measure of some matters recurring as the decades of this history have passed. Seems to me very healthy that the more focused psychology of religion teaching is matched by psychology teaching that looks at other aspects of human functioning. And at this point, I have to fess up and to having jumped to paragraph and totally omitted to mention the undergraduate programs which developed in psychology and philosophy, psychology and theology, very much piloted, held together by Jonathan Luce, and of course, and this is the cue because it was a visual cue, the work in philosophy and psychoanalysis that's been done by Michael Lacewing. So a variety of work in psychology touching on matters religious in the college. I mentioned the renaming of the Department of Pastoral Studies. Started off as Pastoral Theology, I think, became Pastoral Studies, and now sits as Pastoral and Social Studies. Actually, I'm sorry, it doesn't. It now sits as part of theology, doesn't it? Yes?
It's re-amalgamated with theology.
Right, so it's merged back into theology. It did have a period as the Department of Pastoral Studies, and the view that it needed renaming was supported by all sorts of different arguments. One of them being that the name had a certain connotation, a link back into Heythrop's rural past. We received an application which I treasure. I don't mean physically, but the memory of it. The treasure was a candidate who applied and who filled in for the MA in Pastoral Studies a little box which said, relevant previous experience. And in it, this candidate had very carefully written, management of a large dairy herd. Where better to stop? Thank you very much.